Day 6, After Death, When Consciousness Can No Longer Hide. A philosophical lecture inspired by the Tibetan Book of the Dead. We are not gathered here merely to speculate about what happens after death. This is not a lecture meant to satisfy curiosity about the afterlife, nor is it an exercise in mystical imagination. The reason we are here, the reason this story matters, is because the journey we are about to enter is, in truth, a mirror held up to the living mind. The ancient Tibetan tradition speaks of the postmortem state, not as a single event, but as a sequence of psychological and existential passages. These stages are often described as occurring after the body has died, but to read them only that way is to misunderstand their deeper meaning. These stages are not only for the dead, they are symbolic maps of the inner terrain every human being walks through while alive. The fears we suppress, the guilt we refuse to name, the emotions we exile from consciousness because they threaten the image we have built of ourselves. What the Tibetan tradition places on the 6th day after death is not a supernatural punishment. It is the unavoidable encounter with what we have avoided all our lives. This is why the 6th day matters. It is the moment when consciousness can no longer escape itself. Death as the end of self-deception. Let us begin with a difficult idea. Modern Western culture often treats death as a medical event. The heart stops, the brain shuts down, the organism ceases to function. But philosophy has long understood death differently. For thinkers from Plato to Heidegger, death is not simply the termination of life, it is the ultimate revelation of being. On the 6th day, according to the Tibetan account, the dead no longer remember the body. There is no sensation of weight, breath, or physical location, and yet one thought remains: I still exist. This is not identity. This is not personality. It is the bare residue of awareness, stripped of biography and flesh, like the final wave lingering after the ocean is gone still. Consciousness oscillates without ground, without anchor. There is no time. There is no space. There is only what we might call the field of awareness itself. At first, there is silence, but this silence is deceptive, because silence, when sustained long enough, begins to echo. The emergence of the shadow. From this fog-like stillness, forms begin to arise. Not immediately, not violently. They emerge slowly, as if shaped by memory itself. These are not external demons. They are not invading forces. They are the psychological residues of a lifetime. Jealousy that was never acknowledged, anger that was rationalized as righteousness, shame that was buried beneath productivity, resentment disguised as moral superiority. What was once pushed into the unconscious now externalizes itself. The tradition describes them as wrathful figures, terrifying in appearance. But this language is symbolic. What is truly frightening is not their form, it is their familiarity. The dead recognizes them not as strangers, but as fragments of the self. The first reaction, denial. The immediate response is protest. This is not my fault. Others made me this way. I was forced. I was wronged. I had no choice. This too is deeply human. Psychology tells us that the ego survives by displacement, by assigning responsibility outward in order to preserve internal coherence. But here, something is different. There is no audience to convince, no social structure to validate excuses, no moral tribunal to argue before. There is only awareness, and awareness does not negotiate. The light that does not comfort. Then appears a light, not warm, not merciful, not condemning. It is neutral clarity. Where the light falls, memory awakens. Not selectively, not narratively, but precisely. Moments of cruelty, once justified by stress. Moments of hatred born from the fear of being unloved. Moments where one lied not to others, but to oneself. And finally, the most painful realization that the deepest suffering one fled from was not inflicted by others, but generated internally. This is not moral judgment. It is existential recognition, philosophical interpretation, judgment as self-disclosure. In Western philosophy, this moment has a name, though it is rarely spoken plainly. Heidegger called it being toward death. He argued that only a being who can anticipate death is capable of authenticity. Why? Because death strips away roles. It annihilates distraction. It exposes the self without defense. Death, in this sense, is not the enemy of life. It is the condition that makes truth unavoidable. The sixth day represents the collapse of what existentialists call bad faith, the lifelong habit of fleeing from responsibility for one's own being. There is no judge here, but awareness itself. No punishment, only recognition. No sentence, only understanding. Why this matters to the living. Now, let us return to the real reason we are here. Because this encounter does not require death to occur. Every human being lives with fragments of this sixth day already present, in moments of sleeplessness, in flashes of unprovoked anger, in the quiet discomfort we cannot name. The Tibetan text externalizes these forces after death, so that the living may recognize them before it is too late. The question it asks is not, what happens after you die? But rather, what truths are you refusing to face while alive? A quiet invitation. This series is not an exploration of the afterlife for its own sake. It is an invitation to self-examination, a philosophical mirror disguised as a story about death. If through this journey you discover even a single moment of clarity, a small fracture and self-deception, then this lecture has done its work. I invite you to continue this journey with me, not loud, not urgent, but quietly and attentively. If these reflections resonate with you, I encourage you to subscribe, not as an algorithmic gesture, but as a commitment to sustained reflection. And now, let us proceed slowly into the story of the sixth day, where consciousness enters its most difficult passage. The dawn arrives, silence stirs, and awareness begins to remember itself. Day 6, after death, the trial that is not a punishment. A philosophical lecture on shadow, fear, and the completion of being. Ladies and gentlemen, let us begin by correcting a fundamental misunderstanding. The judgment of the sixth day is not a religious punishment. It is not a divine courtroom. It is not a moral sentencing imposed from outside. What unfolds on this day is something far more intimate and far more demanding. It is a rite of passage in which consciousness encounters the parts of itself it spent a lifetime denying. The so-called wrathful deities described in Tibetan tradition are not external beings waiting to condemn the dead. They are not monsters roaming a metaphysical realm. They are symbols, precise, psychologically sophisticated symbols of a distorted self-image, projected outward when the ego collapses. What terrifies the dead is not judgment. It is recognition. Fear as projection. The tradition tells us something profoundly modern. When the deceased fears these figures, they grow larger. When the deceased stares at them silently, without resistance, they dissolve. This is not theology. This is psychology. Fear feeds projection. Acceptance dissolves it. What we refuse to face internally must appear externally. What we acknowledge internally no longer needs to appear as an enemy. Psychological interpretation, the explosion of the unconscious. From the perspective of modern psychology, the sixth day represents the eruption of the unconscious. During life, consciousness survives by repression. We suppress anger to remain socially functional. We bury grief to remain productive. We disguise envy as moral critique. But repression does not erase emotion. It merely postpones its return. Sigmund Freud famously warned, "What is repressed will inevitably return, and it will return in distorted form." The sixth day is precisely that return. All that was silenced erupts at once. And because there is no longer an ego strong enough to contain it, the psyche experiences its own contents as external terror. The dead wanders through a hell of his own making, not because he is evil, but because he never learned to listen. Jungian interpretation meeting the collective shadow. Carl Jung deepens this understanding. From his perspective, the monsters encountered on the sixth day are not merely personal. They are archetypes of the collective unconscious, symbols of destruction, wrath, chaos, annihilation. These are not abnormalities. They are human, universal. To face them is not to face one's personal failure. Alone it is to confront the shadow of humanity itself. This is why the experience feels overwhelming. The dead is not merely meeting his own darkness. He is meeting what humanity has always been capable of. And yet, this does not make the encounter meaningless. It makes it essential. The encounter with the shadow. From within the darkness, a whisper emerges. You are looking at what you refused to see. This is not your enemy. This is your denied self. The instinctive response is flight. And when the dead runs, the shadow grows. Because the shadow feeds on avoidance. But when the dead stops, when awareness pauses, when breath steadies, the shadow begins to shrink. This is one of the most important lessons the tradition offers. Liberation does not begin with resistance. It begins with attention. Only by facing fear does fear lose its power. The courage to embrace the shadow. At this moment, something remarkable happens. The dead raises his head. He looks directly into the darkness, and within it, a faint light begins to emerge. This is not salvation descending from above. It is integration rising from within. Jean-Paul Sartre once wrote, "Hell is other people." But on the sixth day, the dead understands the deeper truth. Hell was never other people. Hell was the refusal to accept oneself. With this realization, the dead whispers, "I forgive you, and I forgive myself." This is not sentimental forgiveness. It is existential acceptance. And as these words settle, the wrathful figures transform. Their fire turns white. Their terror softens into clarity. The light does not judge. It embraces individuation, the birth of the true self. Carl Jung gave a name to this process, individuation. It is the harmonization of consciousness and the unconscious. The birth of the self, not as ego, but as totality. When the dead embraces fear, he understands something radical. Light and darkness are not opposites. They are complementary conditions of wholeness. The monsters dissolve because they were never monsters. They were fragments demanding recognition. Through them, the dead recovers his completeness. He speaks quietly. "I feared them, but they were me." And for the first time, consciousness rests without tension, without defense. Enlightenment beyond fear. Across traditions, the insight converges. Buddhism teaches enlightenment lies on the far side of fear. Christian scripture echoes. Perfect love casts out fear. 1 John 4:18. Fear is the consciousness of separation. Enlightenment is the consciousness of integration. When fear dissolves, the illusion of isolation dissolves with it. The dead no longer says, "I am." He whispers instead, "I am one within the light." Twilight, the quiet integration of being. As the sixth day draws to its close, consciousness becomes still, like moonlight resting on a lake. The dead gazes into the water. He sees no monster, no gods, only being itself, the face where light and shadow coexist without conflict. He speaks one final sentence: "I have passed through my shadow. My path now continues into light." Time dissolves, sound fades. Consciousness is absorbed into a vast luminosity, not warm, not cold, silent. Philosophical conclusion: the completion of being. Death, then, is not annihilation. It is the return of being to itself. Fear is the final hallucination of consciousness, and when that hallucination dissolves, separation ends. What remains is unity. Light and darkness are not enemies. They are two faces of completion, and so are the pains and confusions of life. They are not punishments. They are initiations, doors, not endings. This was a story about death, but in truth, it was always a story about life and about the courage required to face oneself. If this journey has left even a faint trace within you, I invite you to continue walking this path of reflection with me. Subscribing is not a gesture to an algorithm. It is a quiet threshold, one that opens again when thought calls. Until we meet again on the deeper road of reflection.